Welcome to The Voice of Retail. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc. This podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Retail Council of Canada. On this special episode, I am thrilled to be sharing a full episode from Season 3 of my Remarkable Retail podcast, a discussion with my podcast partner, Steve Dennis. Steve is an advisor, keynote speaker, and author of the best-selling Remarkable Retail, How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Disruption. I launched the Remarkable Retail podcast in 2020, and we just kicked off Season 3, which also now includes a YouTube channel. Join Steve and I as we use his 8 Essentials of Remarkable Retail framework to explore modern retail before, during, and after the COVID-19 crisis. Along with special guests, including top retailers and industry thought leaders, we explore the latest events within retail industry and beyond for a lively and interactive journey to remarkable retail. In this episode, The Hybridization of Retail, we go deep on a growing trend that Steve introduced in his book and recently unpacked in a Forbes article, namely, how so many aspects of retail, stores, supply chains, brand distribution strategies, and more, are moving from roles that are largely singular in purpose to becoming, or needing to become, hybrid in nature. This shift is profound, requires potentially massive changes over time, and we argue, not yet getting the attention it deserves. Let's listen in now. Welcome to Remarkable Retail Podcast, Season 3, Episode 2. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
Well, in this episode, Steve, we wanted to focus on the thinking around post-COVID, the post-COVID era, as we turn our minds to that. You wrote a great article in Forbes, actually kind of a lengthy article. And it was a great
Too
read.
long is what you're saying?
Well, no, it's longer than your average Forbes article, which are kind of snack size, but it looked like you were really starting to get that framework, post-COVID framework. What did you call it? The hybridization of retail. So,
right.
We're going to get into that in the episode. But when you were putting fingers to keyboards, give me a top line. What were you thinking, just to give a preview of what's to come in the episode?
Well, I've gotten really interested in this idea. In fact, I've got a new keynote based on it. I touch on it in the book. First, I thought about it mainly as this idea of physical and digital being more hybrid. But then as I started to think about it more, I saw this hybridization appearing in a number of places. Physical stores becoming more hybrid, supply chain, go-to-market strategies with different formats. So I've just been kind of delving into that and seeing some of the trends and trying to organize it in a little bit different way. So I got some of that out in the Forbes article. There's, believe it or not, a few things I left out that I would have liked to include because it was getting quite lengthy. So in this episode, we get to, as we say, unpack that a little bit.
Well, before we get to the episode, we should probably talk about anything that's struck your attention or grabbed your attention in the retail news. I have a question for you. Are you a fan of the movie Scarface by Al Pacino? Scarface. Remember that movie? Are you a fan?
I do. I actually had a big pile of stuff in front of me that I cleared off before we shot the episode. But yes, I am.
Well, there's a scene in it which I love, which is how he says, "I'm making moves. He's coming from nothing and he's making moves." It feels like that's the theme for what's happening in retail now, right? The COVID era is, largely behind us. And I see a bunch of moves happening. Some moves should have been done years ago that kind of jumped out, but other moves are starting to get interesting. And that's what's grabbed my attention. What do you think? Anything jump out at you?
Yeah, there's a lot of activity. I mean, which we've touched on a little bit. A lot of store openings that are going on the part of traditional players and digitally native brands. We're seeing a lot of partnerships. So Nordstrom announcing, I guess last week or this week, acquisition and partnerships with ASOS and some of their brands, which I think is part of stuff we've gotten into before, which is just some of these originally online only brands need that physical presence, whether it's their own stores or partnering up with people like Nordstrom, Target, et cetera. But it's also, I think, an interesting strategy on the part of retailers to go out and find these brands that are relatively new, innovative, maybe attract a younger customer. In Nordstrom's case, that's a challenge, but also give retailers a point of differentiation compared. It's not products that can easily be shopped on Amazon, for example, or they're not brands that are carried at your most direct competitors. So I think it makes a lot of sense.
Well, I mean, that's a great point. it's like they're a captive brand, right? Because if you're not on Amazon, we know Amazon's now the biggest fashion retailer, but fashion is more like apparel, right? Basics, basically. They're a big basics retailer. So that's a nice place, I think it feels like, for Nordstrom to play. One thing that grabbed my attention, we talked about it off mic, was this big global investment into Flipkart, which is in India. And it caught my attention because my pension invested in it. The Canadian pension plan was a big investor in it. So it caught the Canadian attention that, making moves globally. To me, it feels like that we're going to enter. Look, and you got to partner with somebody. It's not unusual for partnerships to be happening all year long, right?
Sure.
But I just feel like there's going to be a lot happening. Some of it is, should have happened maybe 2 years ago or longer. But the other thing I wanted to get your feedback on was eMarketer put out some results on e-commerce, some very interesting results,
right.
I thought. And you said you had a couple of takeaways from it. So what was your observation about their latest numbers?
Well, folks may be familiar with eMarketer. They do a lot of forecast statistics, research in e-commerce in particular. So they updated their forecast this week for the U.S. e-commerce market. And there were a few things that jumped out. And I guess we'll put the link in the show notes so people can see, because my holding up the chart probably isn't going to work too well, or maybe we can insert a PowerPoint slider or something. But to no one's surprise, big spike in e-commerce sales last year. Starting to see it, or at least the forecast is that it will moderate quite a bit this year. Not totally unexpected, but I'd say the big takeaway in terms of the overall numbers is that they predict we're largely going to get back to kind of the pace we have seen for really a decade, which is e-commerce growing in the vicinity of 15% year over year. Brick and mortar sales, despite the retail apocalypse narrative, still positive, though barely. So the share is changing, but we're really going to get into be at a higher level by virtue of the pandemic, but kind of settle back into a pretty similar pattern. The second thing, and I go into this quite a bit in chapter 6 of my book, Shameless Promotion. The chapter is called "The Future Will Not Be Evenly Distributed," quoting a great Canadian, William Gibson. But among the things I get into that chapter is a lot of times when we talk about e-commerce is 15% of total retail, or 20% or 22% or whatever, that's the entire industry. And what this data shows, which I've known, but they really cull it out or present it in more detail, are the widely different market share penetration depending upon the category. So books, music, games, office supplies, 50, 60, 70% online share. And then you get into like auto parts and grocery, and it's low to mid single digits. So I think most people generally know this, but nobody except Amazon, maybe in Walmart, is in every category. So it's much more important to look at what's going on in your particular category. The other piece, which we've talked about a million times, is there's the aspect that is really pure e-commerce, where the store is not involved, and then there's the e-commerce where stores are very much involved, which maybe brings me to number 3, which is, and this has been pretty true, I think, for a number of years, is that if you look at the top 10 companies in e-commerce, 7 of the 10 are mostly brick and mortar retail. So Amazon, eBay, Wayfair in the top 10 as, more or less pure plays. But then you've got Walmart, Apple, Home Depot, Target, Best Buy, Costco, Kroger as the other big players.
And let me give you some Canadian context. So Canada has typically been a bit behind the U.S. for a whole bunch of reasons in adoption. But last year we had about 70 to 75% growth in e-commerce, which is number 2 in the world. Argentina had more growth than us, was 100%. We had a pretty big base to start from. So Canada's just I think had a bigger acceleration. I think if the U.S. moved forward 2 years, we've moved forward 5. All going in the same direction, all the same trends. More similarities and differences.
And why do you think that is?
Well, the reason I think we were just farther behind, and it gave Canadians a lot of impetus to go do it, try it more often, particularly in grocery. And grocery, 4.2 million Canadians shopped online for grocery last year, according to my podcast partner, Sylvain Charlebois, for the food professor. 4.2 million Canadians. Don't forget, there's only 18 million adult Canadians. Huge. And grocery spins the flywheel.
Right.
The other thing that is very different is Canada locked down much, much harder. I mean, retailers, non-essential retailers in Ontario, where I am, biggest province, were shut down for 155 days. Yeah. Closed for 155 days. The malls just opened up last week.
Right.
E-commerce had an unnatural lift. That waterline's going to settle, but it's not going to settle where it was. I think that's big contributing factors.
Yeah, for sure. No, it's interesting.
And so, listen, all right, well, this is good. It's summertime. You wouldn't expect us to have any news to talk about, but, it's not a usual summer. Now, before we get to the episode it's retail. Yeah, before we get to the episode, we talk about hybridization. I just want to remind all the folks that we've got a YouTube channel now. So make sure and check into the YouTube channel. These podcast episodes every 2 weeks until Labor Day. And then we go weekly. And coming up next week, we've got Drew Green, CEO of Indochino, who's done his own deal with Nordstrom, which we're going to talk about. And it's great to have Drew back on the mic. So we're looking forward to that. So without further ado, Steve, let's take the opportunity to dive into this recent article that you published in Forbes, this hybridization of retail. I mean, when I start thinking about retail and its evolution over the past decades, like over the course of our career, it started with basic stores or a catalog, right? You had kind of two ways to order. And then along comes e-commerce, which in its early days, I remember it was just basically like a catalog on steroids, plus people could go and order themselves. But it's really evolved to be so much more. And I think COVID's had a role in if not the evolution itself, the pace of the evolution, the acceleration, as our friend Carl Boutte would say.
Right. Yeah, this is an idea. I felt really compelled to write the article for a couple reasons. One is that I think there's some changes that are going on, which we can talk about in more detail in a second, I suppose. But there's some changes that are going on in retail that are really underappreciated. There's so much attention on the acceleration of e-commerce and all things digital that I think we're losing some of the nuances and some of the things that really retailers have to spend more time on. So I wanted to get that word out. But also it was an idea that I explored in my book, but I don't know that I fully got to explore it as much as in retrospect I might have. So, but yeah, if you think about retail, really through the 90s, for the most part, you had two basic ways to shop. 97, 98% of it was go to a store, pick out what you want, take it home with you. And then you had mail order catalog, which was, you get catalog in the mail and you look at it and then you phone, fax, and eventually order online. So it was pretty binary. There wasn't a lot of overlap. Yes, a few of the catalog players had some stores, but not a lot. Yeah. And overall just represented a very tiny percentage. Yeah. Then e-commerce starts to come along, more or less late 90s, and it's a better catalog for the most part in that it's certainly a different experience to be able to, experience a brand on your computer, do all the things that the web allows you to do much more conveniently, place an order directly, certainly from a marketing standpoint. It created a whole different way of communicating with the customer via email and so forth. Yeah. So
it went beyond the limitations of the print media itself, right? I mean, I've run catalogs before, and they're a big, long process. Of course, big shops like Sears or Williams-Sonoma, they've got that process down. But it's weeks, not days, in terms of I have a product. It's a lot of planning. It's a big machine, and then ultimately you're limited to the ROI of print catalogs and mail distribution. So that broke that wide open, right? We can have a catalog of millions of items. Probably was what kind of spurred, guys like Bezos to start creating e-commerce. Is wait a minute, I don't have to worry about print costs. I can have no end to the number of items. That's probably one of the big, as you said, better catalog, right?
Yeah, I mean, the endless aisle, so-called endless aisle, started to become much more of a thing. The immediacy, the changing in marketing dynamics, and those were huge. I'm not trying to diminish it because obviously we went from a place where this form of direct-to-consumer, previously mail-order catalog to e-commerce started to grow quite dramatically. But the thing that I think was interesting for probably the first really 10 or 15 years of e-commerce is that the distribution side of it really didn't change retail all that much. Stores themselves, they had competitive pressure from e-commerce, but stores themselves didn't change very much by virtue of the growth of e-commerce. And the supply chain, for the most part, didn't change very much. The typical way, if you take music and games, things that can be digitally downloaded out of the equation, but, more of a tangible product, still, and certainly Amazon is the best example of this, we're largely talking about very large eventually automated distribution centers shipping a parcel through the mail to your home or office, which is exactly what Land's End and Williams-Sonoma and Sur La Table and all these guys were doing before. We're now just operating at a much greater scale because this direct-to-consumer piece is not 2 or 3%, now it's 7, 8, 9%.
Right.
But there really wasn't, it still was kind of a dualistic or binary world, which is here's this direct to consumer, which is mostly from a centralized distribution center shipped to you at your home, and stores largely not changing very much. What started to happen, largely by virtue of buy online, pick up in store, and buy online, return to store, and in some cases being able to check store visibility or inventory visibility online, right? Then you started to get stores and online or direct-to-consumer merging a little bit. So there certainly has been this growing blurring of the lines between digital and physical, both because of consumer shopping behavior of digitally influenced purchases in stores. But really, a lot of that became or remained pretty separate. What I think what picked up steam pre-COVID, but has been taken to a whole new level now, is the hybrid nature of the shopping experience and how that has really started to transform the stores themselves and the supply chain in particular in pretty profound ways.
What in your mind were the antecedents to that? As I think of terms like omni-channel and cross-channel, those things were present in the before time. In the years pre-COVID, you had curbside. You had the beginnings of many, many things. Even back to the catalog era, you had places in the store where you could pick up your catalog order.
Sure.
And you had curbside pickup, and these felt like the antecedents. So they were there. So what's changed now? Is it if you were in store design 20 years ago, you probably 30 years ago, 40 years ago, you may have been asked to cooper together some kind of process where people could pick stuff up and drop stuff off. But what is so fundamentally different in your mind than it's beyond omni-channel? It's this full hybridization. And I think you break this down in a couple of really interesting areas. So we get to unpack this, like the store. Let's start with the store. What's so fundamentally different that you want people now to sit up and pay attention and say something has meaningfully changed in the way you need to think about the store?
Well, I think some of these forces have been building for quite some time. The consumer shopping behavior, I've been saying, and others have been saying for a long time, consumers are really brand centric. Like, they don't make nearly the distinction between stores and online that a lot of retailers think. But as more product or as more shopping behavior moved to being digitally led, and more retailers started to build these functionalities, whether that's existing legacy retailers or some of these newer brands that really built for an omni-channel world, as much as I hate the term omni-channel, but basically said, customer is the channel. We understand some customers are going to research online, go to a store. Other people are going to go to a store and then buy online later, right? So there's just this constant building of this consumer behavior. I think the thing that really started to tip the scales, though, were smart devices, because before smart devices, going online, so to speak, was a pretty deliberate activity. You went to a computer that was in your home or in your office. You didn't have this mobility that broke sort of that behavior of, okay, now I'm going to shop online, or now I'm going to go to a store. Now you can be shopping anytime you want. So again, this has been a pretty steady progression. This didn't happen overnight, but I think these forces in terms of consumer behavior, mobile shopping better websites, new business models that weren't so stuck in this siloed world. That all kept building. And I think what COVID did was it certainly accelerated more of this digitally led shopping behavior. But it also made clear when stores were closed or largely closed that customers do value the immediacy of a store.
We'll be right back with episode number 2 of Remarkable Retail, Season 3, right after this message. If you're enjoying this interview, you may want to join us for Commerce Next IRL on September 28th, 29th at the New York Hilton Midtown. Some of the speakers you'll be seeing including Noam Paransky, Chief Digital Officer at Tapestry, Ekta Chopra, Chief Digital Officer at Alf Beauty, Matt Guerin, GM of e-commerce at Everlane, Alex Waldman, co-founder and creative director at Universal Standard, Jennifer Patrick, Global Branding and Packaging Director at Patagonia, and many more. Commerce Next IRL will cover themes such as the resurgence of brick-and-mortar retail and its impact on e-commerce, and how to prepare for a cookieless future. We can't wait to get the Commerce Next community together in person, and hope you'll join us. Learn more and register now at commercenext.com.
We saw so much curbside pickup, buy online pickup and store type of activity just spike like crazy. And stores had to respond to that. The other thing, which has been building pre-COVID, but again, was just kind of put at a whole new level, is this battle for convenience. And even if you have 2 or 3 large distribution centers and, great rates with FedEx and all this kind of stuff, there's just cost and time challenges from shipping all of your products from a centralized distribution facility. And so some retailers said, well, gee, we don't have to think about it as having 2 or 3 distribution centers in the country. We've got 900 distribution centers or 1,000 distribution centers because we have all these stores.
Right. You've got this, I still feel or perceive this philosophical difference in when I have these conversations with retailers. Some feel like e-commerce, pickup, curbside, BOPUS are expensive ways to use their existing property. Can't people just come and shop the way we built the store? And then I think others are, and this is what feels like you're talking about, others are saying, well, this can be a very inexpensive way to handle the unit economics of shipping, plus give it a strategic advantage. Why do you think it's taking retailers a long time to get sorted on that second way of thinking? One thing that, as I continue to reflect on the COVID era and what it's actually meant, and I don't think we know that yet, is, demand for e-commerce skyrocketed a couple of years in advance. It was always coming. So, as you know, in the old saying in retail, volume solves some sins. So now you've got some volume that make the things make sense. Is that all that it took? Was it the volumes would go up, or is there more at work here?
Well, I think that's certainly kind of rubbed a lot of retailers' face in the challenge, so to speak. When you had all this inventory, in essence, trapped in these stores, and when consumer behavior shifted so abruptly and you've got all this new traffic to a website, it's pretty hard to ignore that. It's really in reaction to some changes, many of which we're already seeing kind of a regression to the mean, or at least some moderation.
Sure.
So,
sure.
But I think the thing that's kept, and I am a little bit like a broken record on this, but I think a lot of it is cultural and organizational, and in some cases the way the systems are set up, because so many existing retailers have largely built these silos between brick and mortar and digital. And despite all the discussion of omnichannel for 9 or 10 years, there's still a lot of separation, a lot of metrics that are channel specific, and organization and systems and so forth that have kept these separate. And some of the smartest retailers, the retailers that benefited from the COVID time, were breaking down those silos and thinking about their stores more as a hybrid pre-COVID. But I think now as retailers look at the success that Tractor Supply, Best Buy, Target, others have had from things that they've been working on for years, that just causes them to go, maybe there's a different way of doing it. But if you just look at the data, it's not so much that e-commerce is growing in so much in the traditional way, i.e. order online, we ship it to your home. So much of it has just been pushed to consumers wanting to go get it themselves, right? Or retailers just doing the math and, to your point, saying, well, actually, maybe it's cheaper for me to fulfill from a store, or it's cheaper for me to shave a day or two off of delivery time, which is becoming more and more important as a decision criteria. So I think the data is just overwhelming. But the resistance, I think, aside from the organizational and cultural resistance, is the existing installed base, so to speak, right? If you've built a store for a singular purpose and suddenly you're going, oh, wow, now I'm fulfilling 20, 30, 40% of my e-commerce orders from store, whether that's shipping them or customers coming to get them. And, I'm getting a lot more buy online, return to store. Actually I'm starting to realize the marketing benefits to the brand from my store. Maybe I need to think about how I invest in my stores in a different way. So all these forces have been accumulating. There's plenty of models, I guess, to look at now that are having some success that think about their stores in a different way. So I think there's just waking up to a reality that's been brewing for a number of years.
Let's talk about shopping centers not really changing gears, but because you talk about this in the article. Would you agree that there's a future for A-class malls? What's your perspective around the future of malls, and then what do they need to do to be part of this future?
So I think there are two fundamental dynamics going on with malls. But to answer your question, I'm generally pretty positive, I guess, or at least optimistic towards the A malls. Not everyone, but the majority of them, and generally pretty pessimistic about all the other malls. The first factor is just in general what I talk about in the book, which is there's been this collapse of the middle. Most regional malls, both in terms of their location and the way they've put together their tenants, are really built for a totally different era that doesn't exist anymore. The change that they would have to undergo is very, very massive. So their ability to reinvent themselves at anything remotely close to what they've been doing, I think is pretty much zero. So most of them are going to get bulldozed or massively repurposed. I think the A malls, they have a reason for being largely because they have unique tenant mix. They're in areas of great demographics, and so they can carve out a place. They certainly have to evolve, but I don't think they need to have nearly the degree of change, kind of by virtue of the collapse of the middle. But one of the things that I think mall operators are fundamentally missing is, again, it's the same kind of dynamic for an individual store. They built the real estate, and sorry to make it all about real estate, really, because it's not. But just it's easy to visualize, right? Like they built those stores for the kind of consumer demand that existed a decade or more ago, generally. And again, their model was all about you go there to see stuff, pick it out, maybe get some sales help, and take it home with you. And that's still going to be a very, very important thing going forward. But the entertainment value of malls, the marketing and brand enhancement value of malls, the fulfillment and service role of malls, just like it's changing at stores, it's changing for malls. And most malls have not even come close to dealing with this in terms of having centralized pickup and for online orders, or some of them moved to that in the COVID times. But again, it's they're very built. The other thing that I think affects real estate, not just the malls, but the commercial real estate industry, is they're used to getting paid on a percentage of sales rung up in a store. But if your physical space has a significant role in driving your online business, that's just a flawed formula. You're going to have to figure out how to solve for that and how to invest in those malls with the reality that they're building brands in the trade area, and not all of that is going to be reflected by what gets rung up in that store.
Though I guess to their benefit, anything shopped online and picked up in store, I mean, this is where you get into the nuances of who tracks what and what accounts for what. But if I'm in my local, I mean, there's when we go beyond A malls, there's a lot of communities across North America with, very good malls that are B and C, smaller community malls. How can they survive? I mean, could they not earn the revenue from the many, many retailers that are in them, both local and Main Street, and some anchors that generate online revenue shipped to those stores? In other words, can they turn it around? I mean,
well, this is where it gets down to some of the specifics. There are certainly some malls that are classified as B malls that could redevelop part of the property, add a hotel, add apartments, add some other things that would take some of the space that's essentially dead and not only earn some income from it, but perhaps generate some incremental traffic. But part of the problem for a lot of malls is there aren't tenants for that space, right? A lot of the sort of usual suspects, whether we're talking about anchors like Sears, JCPenney, and others, are pulling back so much. And a lot of the apparel players that had big presence in malls are also greatly consolidating. And there aren't enough Pelotons and Warby Parkers in the world to take that much square footage. So it is challenging. I certainly think if they've got great real estate and a lot of the good qualities of what makes for good real estate, there are some pretty aggressive re-tenanting things they can do, but it's not going to be going to the usual tenants that have paid the bills for the past decades. It's going to be new sort of tenants, whether that's restaurants or entertainment or something like that. But it's pretty significant, and certainly even a fairly mediocre tenant can generate a fair amount of online business, and if they can figure out a way to participate in that. But I think the challenges for a lot of the real estate is the amount of investment it's going to take to repurpose that. I mean, I'm not trying to be too flip about the bulldozing it, but when you think about how much money it would take to repurpose a mall that's very mediocre, then the question has to be, am I better off bulldozing it and doing something else entirely different with the space? And we're seeing dozens of those right now in the U.S. at least. I don't know so much in Canada or other markets.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, certainly a little bit. I mean, what we see a lot of is food districts, fitness clubs, more of these large format type things. And you've got some really nice B malls that have carved out a nice representation in the community. And it's really then about re-tenanting versus, maybe we're just organically, we're going to have less fashion retailers, particularly after COVID. But maybe they're different types. Maybe they're different types of retailers.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that perhaps is a little bit unique to the U.S. is there was such a formula, and I, having worked at Sears back in the day, Sears was a big driver in making a lot of this happen. There was such a formula of building these big regional centers with 3 or 4 anchor, department store anchors and a huge parking field. And so in many cases, the center itself is kind of isolated.
Move on from shopping centers, because I think we'll be coming back to many of these issues over the course of season 3, because they're so vitally important, right? We're at this juncture here where we've just experienced this thing, COVID. Many of the world, by the way, still experiencing it, so we're not done yet, but we're trying to understand it. Now let's talk about flagship stores. You talk about a hybrid brand distribution strategy. I started to think about a role for flagships. Is there a role for anything beyond just transacting? Like, is that now the primary role? Like, what do you mean by a hybrid brand distribution strategy in retail?
Well, I'll mention briefly before I answer that directly, if you think about at any given store becoming more of a hybrid, so performing the role as advertising, as a service center, the traditional role of going and get stuff and taking it home with you, buy online, pick up in store, all those kinds of things. And when you start to think about, if you're a brand owner like Nike, there's an aspect of your strategy which is very much about building the brand and not worrying so much. I'm not saying they don't pay attention to it, but you're building the brand and you're going to get paid off somewhat by people transacting in that particular location, but they may learn about your brand and go transact at other locations that you own, but also you have wholesale partners. And so if you develop brand preference for Nike, you may then go and buy that at a wholesale partner. So I think this is not a terribly new idea of a flagship store, but I think what we'll see more than just kind of the reinvention of the traditional flagship on Madison Avenue or Fifth Avenue or the Champs-Élysées or whatever. I think you'll see this hybrid distribution strategy where brands are saying, okay, we need to think much more carefully about our own distribution, both our e-commerce and the different formats that we control, but also trying to get the right balance of wholesale partners. And this is a pretty big change. Again, a lot of this goes back to the evolution of e-commerce, where if you were a manufacturer, for the most part, you didn't have any real relationship with the end consumer. But the internet, from a marketing standpoint, but ultimately from a transactional standpoint, has allowed you to sell directly to those end consumers, to get their names, to be able to do your direct marketing stuff. And, that not only gives you more strategic control of your brand, but in many cases, it gives you better economics. So Nike is the poster child for this, but many more manufacturers are really developing their distribution strategy in a much different way than they were just a few years ago, which is, again...
It's still a tricky proposition, though. I mean, Nike, it's good to be king. Canada Goose, good to be king. In other words, there is some fear, at least there is some perspective from retailers that I helped make your brand, and now that you've become a brand, you're off on your own and you're going to cut me off, right?
Sure,
this
right.
Battle between retailers and the brand. Some brands are just as a pure brand. They're very good wholesalers, but they're actually not very good retailers, because that's a whole different organization to set up. So for some, it's an ambition. For some, I think it's still, the vast majority for many is still done in stores. And how do you craft a strategy? And this is a whole topic for a whole other episode, but how do you craft a brand strategy that gets you both a winning strategy direct to consumer and a winning strategy with your retail partners? Because you better be careful how far down that path you go, because you could find yourself out in the wilderness in a bit of trouble.
Yeah, I absolutely think it's worth a separate episode, because I think the dynamics here have changed a lot. You have to be careful. I have had a couple clients in this arena, is the retailers that feel like they're getting cut out by the brand, and also working for a couple brands. I think if you're the brand, you have to really understand how you drive consumer demand, both in the short term and the long term. And you don't want to get too greedy, I guess is the way I would put it.
And you got to be something different too, right? So I was on this one site, I won't mention what it is, and they basically sell direct to consumer what they're selling at the retailer down the street. And I was thinking, okay, but I don't see anything compelling about that in and of itself, other than maybe you strip off a few, ardent, dedicated customers. It really takes more thought than just I'm gonna pull everything together and put in a DTC strategy. There's got to be a there, I think.
Yeah, if you're just like, hey, I want to cut out the middleman and make more money. That's kind of what I mean from a greedy standpoint. Like, you could convince yourself, hey, now that I can go direct, maybe I should go as direct as I can, because who needs these pesky middlemen, right? If that's your primary orientation, I think you're likely to get yourself into trouble. You really have to understand how you drive demand and think longer term, because clearly plenty of customers value going to a multi-brand retailer. They're not just, the only thing I'm ever willing to buy is Nike or Canada Goose or whatever. So if you narrow your distribution too much, you can really be underdeveloping the brand. Right. The flip side is,
if the theme turns on you, right? So you're great now, but brands ebb and flow, right? It's very hard for every brand to have a run without a couple of soft years.
Right, and you don't want to be having to, you probably aren't going to be too welcome when you go running back to your distribution partner saying, oh, take me back, I love you, I promise I'll change, right?
Right.
So, I think you absolutely have to look at this as a long-term strategy and understand the risks. But the flip side, which I've said to some of the retailers that are complaining basically about some of their brands going direct, is, look, the reality is, particularly if they're public companies, they have shareholders, and they're going to do what's in their economic long-term interest. And there's a lot of strategic advantage to controlling your destiny, as well as money to be made if you can appropriately expand your direct-to-consumer business. And certainly if you look at Nike's results, for example, the results are amazing. So now that doesn't mean they'll always be amazing, and Nike is a very special kind of brand. So not everybody can try to do what Nike's doing. In fact, very few could. So you have to be very careful. But I think again, one of the fundamental changes by virtue of e-commerce and by virtue of consumers having this world of choice at their fingertips is that it just allows for a whole different way for consumers to kind of switch things up, to blend what they want. And if retailers are really built for an age that doesn't exist anymore, or brands are built for an age that doesn't exist anymore, they're going to have to respond. And, part of what I argue in the article is, this can require a lot of change, and most retailers are not very far along on the journey.
Well, let's wrap up in terms of this, what this all means to the listeners. Like, if you're a retailer, your brand listening, thinking about this hybridization of retail, how do you get your arms around it? It's a big task. You've just got your arms around surviving, hopefully, through COVID. Now, what are you going to do to make that business thrive as we go forward? What do you recommend? A couple of things that they should do to get their arms around this new reality that is modern retail.
Well, to a certain degree, I think the main piece of advice I would have at both the store level and at the trade area or market level is to really kind of start from scratch and look at consumer behavior, look at what's going on with fulfillment, and say, okay, if I had to do it all over again, and I was going to open a new store, or let's say I was going to open a new market, how would I ideally deploy in my given store and a given market? So if I were going to build let's just say it's a 30,000 square foot store today, where would it be? How would I configure it? What are the different services and roles that store would have to fulfill with that overall lens of the different roles that stores might be providing for you? And similarly, if I look at a given metro area, I would say, okay, well, maybe I've got 5 stores in the market, and they're probably all pretty much the same. But if I had to do it all over again, would I deploy in a different way? Would I have one flagship and 6 satellite locations? That's interesting. Would I, say like a Nordstrom does with their, some listeners are probably familiar with, they basically have the full version Nordstrom, they have an off-price version, and they have these local, or they're starting to have these local stores, which are service only. We're seeing some retailers do fulfillment only stores versus basically consumer facing stores. So I would say strip it down. If I had to do it all over again, what would my store look like, or my stores look like? What would my deployment strategy look like in a given market? Now, that's probably for many retailers going to be really different from what it looks like today. But I think starting with that blank sheet of paper and thinking about that for the future can provide some really good guidance. And if it turns out that you have a bunch of leases that are coming up or opportunities to perhaps redeploy your real estate in a more significant way, not only, a given type of store format, but like I say, the whole market, at least you've got a sense of where you'd ideally like to get to. And then you can kind of work backwards and start to say, okay, well, in terms of investing capital, in terms of reconfiguring. But then, that's going to lead you, the crazy thing and the complicated thing, which is why I say this is really big and hairy in the article, is that's almost certainly going to lead you to thinking about your supply chain strategy, your technology strategy, your
touches everything. Touches everything.
Yeah, I mean the role of a store associate, right? Yeah. So to try to get your arms around it, I think you kind of have to break down to kind of unbundle and then maybe rebundle your strategy and just kind of lay out a sequence. And, for some retailers, it's going to be much more urgent than others, right? So everybody sits in a little bit different place.
Well, I think it's great advice because it reminds me of that moment in Al Gore's movie about the environment, where he said, listen, climate change is so massive, it almost feels too overwhelming. You can't do anything. But the reality is you can chip away at it. Right. And eventually you reach this point of critical mass where you've not just chipped away at it, you've made a meaningful difference. So start at the beginning, right? How would you reconceptualize the store? What would it look like today? Can we do that in an entire market? Maybe we try, that kind of, take it on one step at a time without getting too overwhelmed by as you say, the big hairiness of it, the enormity of the change.
Well, first of all, I think it can definitely inform some testing of formats, or standing up maybe some different fulfillment or what have you. But the worst case scenario, and the thing, frankly, I'm most fearful of, and I've been saying this for a while, but I think as I've dug into this hybridization issue, it creates a different sense of urgency, which is the worst case scenario is you keep trying to polish what you have, which is already decidedly mediocre. So if retailers are re-upping leases and they're painting the walls and putting in some new fixture, putting in a coffee shop, a little store in a store or whatever, and thinking like that's the investment that's going to get them to the next level, they're probably just delaying the inevitable. So without this kind of stripping down to the studs or whatever expression you want to use, thinking more creatively, you may not see some of the realities that you have to deal with. And, like I said, this is not going to be an existential crisis if they don't, for every retailer, like, if I don't start working on this very aggressively in the next few months, I'm out of business. I'm not suggesting that, though. For some, it might. But you constantly have this decision about how to invest your time and energy, what technologies you want to lean into, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if you don't have that clear view of where you think you might need to get to over the long term, you're likely to make some perhaps irreversible mistakes. Not to play out the climate change thing too much.
Yeah, I guess it harkens back to something you quoted in the first book, and the second is that best time to plant a tree philosophy, right? You probably should have been working on this 20 years ago, but the next best time to start working on this is tomorrow or today, right?
Yep.
All right. Listen, that's a great sentiment to leave our discussion with today. And of course, for the listeners, we'll be coming back to these issues, both with interviews and with just you and me chatting and looking at looking at what's new in the news and putting this framework on it. So until then, let's wrap it up here. All right, if you liked what you heard or saw today, please follow us on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, or your favorite podcast platform so you can catch up on all our great interviews and insights and episodes that'll show up every week. If you subscribe, be sure and check out, as I said, our new YouTube channel, Remarkable Retail.
Well, I'm always shamelessly promoting my book, Remarkable Retail, How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Disruption, which is available just about everywhere that you'd like to find your books in ebook format and audiobook as well. And I'm on social media, usually at StephenPDennis.com. You can also find me on my website, which is www.stephenpdennis.com.
All right, and I'm Michael LeBlanc, the producer and host of the Voice of Retail podcast and a bunch of other stuff. You can find me on LinkedIn or meleblanc.co, or should I say www.meleblanc.co.
I know, I was going old school.
You went old school on that.
That's fun, HTTP.
How do I get to a URL again?
I can't remember.
Back to the future. Hey, great episode, great insights. I think they're going to form more than just an episode. They're going to really form a backbone of season 3 beyond the episode. So looking forward to continue to explore. And until then, stay safe, my friend. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of The Voice of Retail. Be sure and follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you enjoy podcasts so you don't miss out on the latest episodes, industry news, and insights. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a rating review, as it really helps us grow so that we continue to get amazing guests onto the show. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc, president of Emmy LeBlanc Company, Inc., and if you're looking for more content or want to chat, follow me on LinkedIn or visit my website at emmyleblanc.co. Until next time, stay safe, have a great week.